might want that. Morgan, Jamie, Jack, Jaden, Maya, Cannon, Brady, Noel, Colin, Caitlin, and Zach. Okay. Couple of quick things before we jump into that Korea and Vietnam. If you recall, we had looked at our schedule because we can't watch videos in here. And I know I don't have that extra credit list done for you. I have like it on a piece of paper. It's empty today. Got a good start. So, so I was looking at the schedule, and on our announcements, I had put that on the calendar, right? And we are scheduled for a documentary on Wednesday, which we wouldn't be able to see here. So I will check to see if that is one that you can get for free too. Put it on the list if it is. But today I want to talk about the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Not sure if we're going to get through them. I tend to get stuck in the weeds because it's really interesting, and I want to go off on this track and that track. I'm going to try to keep myself to the outline and not like talk about all of the interesting stuff. But try to keep it simple because this is an overview class, right? We can teach, and we do have a class on the Vietnam War that we talk about the Vietnam War all semester. This is not that class, so I have to like do it in like 3 things. 3 main points, maybe a couple more. But I'm going to try to get as far as I can through this, talking about the Korean War and the Vietnam War, put it in context with the Cold War, right? That fight against communism that we were talking about. The whole domino theory, remember that domino theory, containment, keeping it where it is, don't let it spread any further. Well, Korea and Vietnam, their history challenges that containment theory, and it's like, oh no, it's spreading, and like, oh, the dominoes are gonna fall, and the whole world's gonna be communist soon, right? So we're gonna talk about that in the context. We have to keep the Cold War in mind. Obviously, these are not Cold War, right? They're actually fighting and shooting, so it's what we would call a hot war. But it's all about that containment of communism. So we will not have class on Wednesday. And Cannon, if you want to talk about your class, we'll make do your test.
Okay.
Speaking of tests, I have your test graded. I haven't had a chance to put them in the grade book. They're graded. It was like good, and I'm like trying to scramble to get to my computer. But I will get those grades posted for you. I can't hand them back until everybody has the test. I'll get those grades posted. If you turned in blue books, I'll get that posted for you as well. I just haven't sat down to log things. They're in my handy dandy bag. Carry that around. So when we get done today, I'm going to take about 5-10 minutes before we end class today because I want to talk about your paper on the My Lai massacre. This is part of the Vietnam War. So I want to get to the Vietnam War as much as possibly can, and then we'll talk about that paper. And if you want to take time on Wednesday, you want to just kind of dig into that book a little bit. I didn't bring a copy of the book, but y'all have it. It's really tiny. Really tiny. We'll talk about the book and talk about some strategies, the best ways to go about that paper. Okay? So no class on Wednesday. I will post it. Although when we don't have classes are easy days to remember, right? We don't forget those. We don't forget those at all. So it may be that that last week of classes, I think we had said that last week we would make the no classes week, remember? For that documentary that we would have watched the week after Thanksgiving. So we may need to have class on December 5th, I'm not sure, but for sure we won't on December 7th. And as we get closer to that time period, we'll figure out what we want to do about the final exam. Do you want to do it that last week of classes and be done? Or do you want to give yourself a little bit of extra time? I don't know. I'll have to look and see when because that might influence us, when our final exam is scheduled, if it's Monday or Wednesday. That sound good? You'd rather be done with it? Yeah.
I've got to be done with the book.
Oh, you will. Oh, 12, 13, 14. You will. It will either be, because final exam week is the 12th through the 16th. So a Monday, Wednesday class, our exam would either be on the 12th or the 14th. And maybe if it's Monday, y'all go, well, let's just do it on Monday and give ourselves the weekend. If it's Wednesday, you might want to go, I don't want to be here until Wednesday, right? So we'll just look at that later. And I'll find our final exam schedule and what time they have us scheduled. Okay? That sound good? All right. So today, I want to get as far as I possibly can talking about the Korean War and a couple of events that John F. Kennedy had to deal with during his presidency, and then the U.S. getting involved in the Vietnam War. And we have to keep in mind this whole war against communism, the Cold War. So I have the National Security Council paper 68. Remember we talked about that last week? And I popped it up there again just to refresh ourselves and to think about it. Because what does that paper say? The world is divided between two forces. The forces of what? Slavery, which will be, and freedom. And what is the U.S.'s role in this war, according to the National Security Council? Containment. And to be the policeman of the world, right? So the U.S. is going to take the lead, and this paper, the NSC 68 says we are determined and we are focused on stopping the spread of communism, and we'll do whatever it takes. We've got that domino theory, we've got that containment theory that American leaders have been talking about, and so now we've beefed up our military and we're prepared to go, right? This is going to be our task. So, what is happening in Korea?
Are they recovering like right now? They were recovering from World War II, basically, weren't they?
Yeah, they're not involved in the war a ton, but they are becoming heavily influenced by
China.
and Russia. I'm gonna find,
Oh, we're that far. Okay, I know where we're at now.
yeah. Oh. Oh. So I want to look at where we get so China, communist, but Russia, Moscow, is heavily influencing, and we've got um, tiny, tiny. But here's, oh, well, we've got, right, here's the Soviet Union, here's Russia, here's North Korea. So there, and here's China. So most of North Korea is, and here it is on the map, teeny tiny little bit. So most of North Korea has a boundary with China, right? But the Soviet Union has contact and connection here. It's also of interest to them. So the Soviet Union is moving into North Korea. We've got a communist regime that is being established, right? We can see all of these arrows coming down as they're moving into this peninsula. And as this is starting to happen, what's going to pop up in the minds of American leaders, and this is in 1949. Containment, domino theory. Oh no, they're on the move, right? The forces of slavery versus the forces of freedom. So they've already committed and granted, well, there's this philosophy of stopping them. Oh, and I'll have to put a timeline up because I like those timelines. Like, right, this is written here, this happens here. Kind of helps me see the picture. But so maybe I'll get that up for next week. But we have this invasion, this communist movement into Korea, and we're moving down into the south, right? U.S. reaction is going to be what? As communists move into North Korea, the United States is going to move into South Korea to try to contain it, right? Push it back, stop it. So what ends up happening, to make a very long story as short as we possibly can, we've got American forces in South Korea. I don't know if I have the number in maybe. I don't, but that would be really interesting. Did I put it in there? Why do I not? I always like to look at those numbers. And what ends up happening is that the Korean Peninsula gets divided at the 38th parallel. So the same thing's going to happen when we get to Vietnam. They're going to be divided at the 17th parallel, so you're going to have to find a way to figure out and remember which one's which, right? So the 38th parallel, the United States forces support the side of democracy and democratic government. And we're going to be the big brother. We're going to uphold independent South Korea. And then the Soviets are going to support North Korea. This ends up breaking out into war, the Korean War, which lasts from 1950 to 1953. And a struggle for autonomy. Who's going to win, right? Who's North Korea going to push its way down into South Korea. And South Korea are the American forces, and the South Koreans going to be able to repel the move of the communists coming down from the Soviet Union and China. And they don't. The 38th parallel becomes, for all practical purposes, a permanent dividing line. We still have that 38th parallel today. Korea is divided. North Korea versus, well, not necessarily versus South Korea. The tension still exists between that communist government in the north and a more democratic government in the south. South Korea is very much an ally of the United States. The United States is an ally of South Korea, really working. North Korea is not good. Not a good place to be, and a lot of oppression going on in North Korea as well. But this turns into a hot war, right? As the United States attempts to stop that movement into North Korea. Was it successful? I mean, depends on how you define success, right? Did they push them out of North Korea and back into North Korea? No. But did they keep them out of South Korea? Yeah. If South Korea had fallen to the communists, would it have continued to take over the world? We don't know, right? I mean, it's kind of like it happened. We don't know what the outcome would have been, had the United States moved in. The League of Nations doesn't exist anymore. The United Nations have been created, and the UN, United Nations forces get involved in this Korean War, and it kind of establishes their legitimacy. They tended to have, and we're not going to probably should spend more time on it, but it's more like a world issue. They have a little bit more. The United Nations was kind of like, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And the UN pulls together forces, right? Its forces, military forces from its joining nations or member nations, and creates a united military front. So the UN gets involved in this too, and it establishes their legitimacy, which really doesn't have a ton of American impact, but important. So long-term significance for the United States, American history, our involvement. Right? And reported on. Putting into place that containment theory and that domino. So Kennedy, the president at this time, and I don't have him on the list, but it was Harry Truman during So in the early 60s, 1960s, John F. Kennedy becomes president. And in his short time, a couple of years that he is president, he is dealing with the Cold War as well. So there's three events, and I just popped that domino theory again. We talked about it last week, but I want us to keep it in mind. Keep that NSC 68 paper, the domino theory. I don't have containment up there, but same thing, right? We have to keep that in the background of our minds and keeping the significance of that. As well. But let me just say, too, that for the significance of the Korean War, I'm kind of backtracking here, it seemed to prove to Americans, especially the administration, that they were right in what they had documented in that NSC papers. Right? The forces of freedom versus the forces of slavery. truly exist, right? The United States needs to be involved. It's kind of, it legitimized that for them. Like, yes, we did the right thing, right? The NSC paper, we were right. We were right about that. So, Kennedy, dealing with issues related to Cuba and Germany seems to be his to Cuba in a couple of ways. In 1959, and I don't know if I put him up there because it's not over there, but I should put him up there because Fidel Castro, long time dictator in Cuba. But in 1959, Fidel Castro takes power in Cuba. And he transforms the Cuban economy into a communist economy. Probably are familiar with where Cuba is. See the green US in the top left corner? Cuba. Pretty close. I want to say it's like 90 miles or something like that. It's off the coast of Florida. And if you are thinking in terms of containment and the domino theory, and if Cuba goes communist, if that domino is heading north, where's it going? Yeah, right? That's really close. That's in our backyard or side yard, whatever it is, right? But it's our neighbor. So Cuba has always been an interest to the United States, and there were a lot of Americans who lived in Cuba and had companies in Cuba. So Castro comes to power in '59. He nationalized a lot of American interests in Cuba, which in terms of what the basic tenets of communism is, do private individuals own companies under communism? No. So when we say he nationalized American interests, American companies that existed in Cuba, he took away private ownership of them, right? They now belong to the government, and the government essentially says everybody owns them, but everybody doesn't, right? I mean, the government is controlling it. So he nationalizes American interests, he nationalizes Cuban, and he puts in place a communist economy and political. So economically and politically, we now have it is a communist regime. A lot of Cubans, when Castro takes over, flee. They do not want to be part of a communist society, and they leave by the thousands, and they come up to the United States. Right? We have a huge Hispanic and a lot of Cubans in Florida, and still, right? They get on rafts and come over and try to make it to freedom in the United States. So Cuba has a pretty rough history. So we have this communist takeover in Cuba, and Kennedy, when he becomes president in '61, was very concerned about how close it is to us. And in April of 1961, there were a group of about 1,400 anti-Castro Cubans, so anti-communist Cubans. And they landed in a Cuban port, a harbor, called the Bay of Pigs. It's a bay, right? Like Chesapeake Bay, the Bay of Pigs. They had been trained by U.S. CIA forces. And the plan, the CIA's big plan was that when these 1,400 anti-Castro, anti-communist Cubans hit the Bay of Pigs, it would spark an internal uprising, and Cubans everywhere would go, yes! And they would rally to the cause, and they would all together seek to overthrow Castro. So they tell Kennedy, this is our plan, President JFK. This is our plan. We have these 1,400 Cubans. They're ready to go. They're ready to overthrow Castro, and we've trained them, and we need to support them. And Kennedy said, do we really want to get involved in that? And he doesn't send American troops. And when that doesn't happen, right, when U.S. troops don't show up to back those Cuban forces, Castro's men move in, capture them, and that Bay of Pigs invasion, I mean, it's Cubans invading Cuba, right? But this attempted overthrow of Castro's government was unsuccessful. This, for communist forces, and it's in Cuba, but who's watching? Moscow's watching, right? They're watching. This makes Kennedy look really, really weak. Now, was he weak? I don't know. I probably would have said, I mean, let's think this through. Yeah, this is in 61. What happened in Korea? Do we want to have a Korea again? And do we want to have a war like 90 miles off the, like, do we really do it? Like, if we had put U.S. troops in there, what would have happened? I mean, we don't know, again, right? Because we really don't know. But if you're really going to overthrow a government, you have to 100% commit. You have to put a lot of troops in there. Would Moscow have backed them? Would they have backed Castro? Would it, I mean, you know, would we have a whole world war going on here again? I mean, we don't know. Or would it just have been the United States versus Fidel Castro in Cuba, and that's it, period? Fidel Castro's forces, or would it have been, right? What would have happened? So, but for Moscow, who's watching, this makes him look incredibly weak, right? Kennedy's not going to act. We can push the envelope, and we're not going to have any kickback. When this happens, the communist forces in the East want to make Berlin, remember that you divided Berlin into an example. and the Soviet Union starts to put pressure in Berlin and threatens to hand over the Soviet sector to East Germany. Now remember, we had, I know this sounds confusing to us, but remember what were the four quadrants? We had East Germany, right? And then after World War II, whose ally was the Soviet Union? The US, the French, right? And the Soviet Union. So they're now going, nope, we're going to hand over our quadrant, right? So they're pushing this envelope. They're using Berlin as this testing point. And in response to it, and once again, Kennedy doesn't want to get involved in a war. And, was he weak? I don't know. Or was he smart? Do we spark another world war again here, right? So what ends up happening is that Berlin Wall separates East Germany from West Germany, and it solidifies. It's kind of like we're really going to cut the East off from you, oh Western America, in your face, right? Western forces. That makes sense. So the Berlin Wall goes up in, I want to say it was 63. No, 61. 61. What did Kennedy do? He said, well, a wall is better than a war. Right? So he is deliberately, whether rightly, I mean, is it the smart thing to do? Is it, what should he have done? Said, okay, it's a wall. We're already separated, right? We already had that separation in Berlin. But that wall goes up in 61, and it becomes that very visible sign of the East versus the West. I am gonna I'm not going to take the time now, but Great Britain. Who were the three? Great Britain. Maybe it was. No, Soviet Union occupies it. Never mind. So it was United States, Great Britain, because that didn't sound right, and France occupied Western Germany. So this all comes to a head in 61. Sorry. Russia's confusing. Because there are allied, and then they're not allied, and then they're not allied. So the Berlin Wall, Kennedy's dealing with the Bay of Pigs, he's dealing with the Berlin Wall, he's doing his very best to not get caught up in war. And I have to say, I'd love to do more research on Kennedy and kind of see his philosophy, but it really seems like when you look at what he's doing, he's flying in the face of the CIA, isn't he? He's going up against the CIA, that National Security Council, right? The policemen of the world, and he's saying, no, we're not going to get drawn in. Because every action he takes, and there's, how there's all sorts of conspiracy theories and theories that are out there. There is a theory that it was actually the CIA that had Kennedy assassinated in 63. I don't know. It's not my area, but whenever I look at this, I kind of go like, like that would be really interesting to dig into and kind of was it just some lone crackpot that, went up to the books depository and killed him in Dallas that day, or was there assassination plot?
If you want to fall into a rabbit hole of information, look up all the comparisons between the Lincoln and the Kennedy assassinations. Everything is exactly parallel.
Yeah, I know. It's some crazy stuff. You can really kind of get lost in it. So, but we don't next time we get lost in it in this class, though, it would be really interesting, wouldn't it? That makes me want to.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it is a rabbit hole, but it is interesting. But he really, and it just strikes me every time you look at what he did. He really is going up against that NSC 60-day paper, because they were pushing for war. We have to go to war if this happens, right? That domino theory, that containment theory, and Kennedy says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to get drawn in. Does it make him look weak? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it makes him look strong. I don't know. So in October of 62, Kennedy has another crisis. See, I have so much work to do, but now I'm going to go start digging into stuff. And Kennedy gets news that the USSR, the Soviet Union, is putting missiles in Cuba. They're building missile bases. Nuclear missiles. And they're aimed at
Florida.
Florida, right? The United States. It's pretty close. They could hit, right? So that's pretty concerning. You're President Kennedy, and you're like, oh, missiles aimed right at us. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? So do you do nothing? Do you do something? We know Kennedy's history. He does not want to get drawn into war. What ends up happening, and to buy time, is that the United States sets up a blockade to keep any more people and materiel from getting into Cuba, where they're building missile sites. Right? So let's just stop it, buy some time, figure out what we want to do. Fortunately, not really sure what prompted him, but Khrushchev, who was the USSR leader at the time, gets word to Kennedy that he's willing to negotiate. And he says to Kennedy's administration, we will withdraw these missiles if you promise that the U.S. will not invade Cuba. And oh, by the way, Khrushchev says, this is kind of a little aside, dear United States of America, we have missiles in Turkey that we might be able to take out. And so we'll check those out, right? So the U.S. Kennedy's administration agrees to not invade Cuba. Now, was Kennedy going to invade Cuba? He didn't want to, it seems. With this potentially the CIA have pushed it, right? That innocent paper, maybe? I don't know. But whatever the case, we promise we won't invade Cuba. Moscow says, okay, we'll withdraw these missiles, and everybody kind of goes, crisis over. So we have this tension that's building. And at that Bay of Pigs, if we wonder what Moscow would have done, what would it have done? If U.S. forces had gone in and backed those 1,400 freedom fighters, Cuban freedom fighters, would Moscow have gotten involved? Would we have had this world war? Would it have been another Korea? Would it have been a Vietnam before Vietnam happened? I mean, who knows what would have happened? But it seems that, very clearly seems that, looking at that Cuban Missile Crisis, if the USSR is putting missiles in Cuba, they are interested in what happens to Cuba. And they are going to support the Castro regime in Cuba. Seems to me. So crisis averted, we avoided war, bless you. Seemed to have taken his goal. And he was assassinated in 63, I believe. Shortly after that. So two wars break out, Korea and Vietnam. Cuba looks like it's a crisis that was averted. Who knows what would have happened had Kennedy allowed the U.S. to be drawn into that, or seen it in a different light, and I look at it that way. So what is happening in Vietnam, and what sparks that Vietnam War? In the 1940s, in the 1940s, this area, here's China again, just for reference, so just a kind of world map here. But this area right here, we've got China, oh, sorry. I do my little cursor and it doesn't show up on my phone. So we have China here, Korean Peninsula, right? And then here, this area here is known as Indochina. And China had a lot of influence. We can see how close it is, right? Cambodia down here, there's the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but we've got Vietnam. South Vietnam, here's that 17th parallel that I mentioned that they end up getting split. So in addition to China, and it's known as French Indochina before it's known as Vietnam, the French had been involved in Indochina as well. They had established colonies. And so we have a French colonial government in French Indochina. Okay? So we've got this Chinese influence, communist, and we've got French colonial influence, politics. Now, who likes to be a colony? Nobody. Did the people in Indochina love their French colonizer? No, they did not. So shortly after World War II, and one of the outcomes that we didn't get into because it's American history, we can't do all of world history here. One of the outcomes of World War II stated that smaller countries that were being overrun and imperialized by bigger countries should be allowed what was known as, or still is known as, self-determination. So nations who have common interests, like a common culture, common history, a common religion, a common language, should be allowed to be independent and so on, right? And this is 19th century liberalism, not the liberalism that we have today. 19th century liberalism, which focuses a lot on independence and liberty and things like that. So nations that had common culture, common history, don't confuse yourself with this though. Self-determination, religion, common language, a common, yeah, those are the big ones. Should be able to determine their own governors and their own government. So let's say we have these 5 little nations that keep getting absorbed by bigger countries and ruled by them. They should be like, oh, there's a little section here that has a common language, common history, common religion, and they're different from these people over here. So they should have their own governments, right? They should be able to govern themselves, self-determination. So when this happens, there was a leader in Indochina who was like, yes, that's right. We should not be governed by France, right? Self-determination. Indochina, otherwise known as Vietnam, ought to be able to govern Vietnam, not China or France, right? So very much influenced by that concept of self-determination, concept of self-government, and being able to be independent. So there's an independent movement. I'm trying to make a very long story short. Led by Ho Chi Minh. And he had actually gone to the Paris Peace Conference. And while he was there, he was like, hey, give us independence too. Recognize our self-determination too. And he gets rebuffed. They're like, no. Sorry, Ho Chi Minh. So he leaves feeling very much like the world at large is against him. And if Vietnam is going to be independent, they're going to have to do it themselves, right? So Ho Chi Minh leads a resistance against the French. And there's a significant battle, and I've got it up there on the identification terms, at Dien Bien Phu, where the French are defeated by Ho Chi Minh's liberation forces. So it's the end of the French in Vietnam, in Indochina. That was in 54. So in 54, there was a peace conference, the Geneva Peace Conference, that was set to establish the outcome of this victory, right? And the defeat of the French in French Indochina. And at that conference, that 17th parallel was, I guess I missed this step. Sorry. So, Ho Chi Minh, this is a really important event. After he's rebuffed by the leaders at the Paris Peace Conference and they don't grant him the self-determination, he goes to Moscow and finds an ally in them. And he says, oh, okay, we're going to be communists now. Are warning bells going off in your head? Domino theory, right? See, this was a really important piece that I forgot. It's really good to know this, right? So he's communist now, and he's just overthrown France. France is not communist, it's part of the free world, right? And so now we have this whole domino theory, containment theory, the NSC 68, all of these warning bells are going off. Oh no, oh no, oh no. And you want to go back to them and say, if you hadn't, just shoved him off in 1945 at the peace conference and helped in Vietnam at that time, things would have been a lot different, right? So after he defeats the French, after his forces defeat the French, kick them out, we've got this Geneva Peace Conference. And so we now have Ho Chi Minh, leader of the force of slavery, right? Versus the forces of freedom, represented by the French, who are now kicked out. So at that conference, he agrees to, and they all agreed to, dividing North Vietnam from South Vietnam at that 17th parallel. Yeah, it's on the board. And they agreed to hold free elections in North and South Vietnam in each section. Let the people decide whether or not they want to be communist or democratic. With a little d, not a political, but a democracy. So, South Vietnam, heavily backed by U.S. forces, resists communist leaders. North Vietnam goes communist, heavily backed by Moscow. This is the USSR versus the United States in tiny, right? Isn't that what we have happening here? Same thing with Korea, trying to do the same thing in Cuba. We have these battlegrounds of extending dominance. Who's going to control, right? Who's going to control? And I don't know what we're talking to. So Vietnam becomes split at that 17th parallel. Kennedy sends in, doesn't really go to war. He sends in what the U.S., well, kind of, terms as advisors to South Vietnam. Green Beret units move in, and they're there to assist South Vietnam from falling to North Vietnam and the communist direction. So he doesn't send them in Bay of Pigs. He doesn't cave to the Berlin Wall pressure. Doesn't cave to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he sends in advisors, not really troops, right? Advisors. And he's assassinated shortly thereafter. So his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, becomes president. And for all practical purposes, Lyndon Johnson is the face of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War becomes known as Johnson War. Under Johnson, and it's a couple years after he becomes president. In '65 is when Johnson really kicks up what he calls what becomes known as an escalation of U.S. forces. And he begins to send in American military troops in order to help the South Vietnamese resist to the North. And he puts into place what was known as Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a bombing campaign, which makes sense, right? Rolling Thunder. And that what he wanted to do with Operation Rolling Thunder was send a message to South Vietnam that, hey, we're here. We're helping you. And he wanted to stop the flow of supplies and troops that were coming from North Vietnam. And I don't know if you saw it, but the map is in our PowerPoint, but there's a Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh Trail where the North Vietnamese are coming down. They were called the so I'm going to give away my age. I was really, really little, very little during the Vietnam War. So the Viet Cong are the North Vietnamese communist forces. We always said our prayers before bedtime, right? And I was super little. My older brother and older sister. And so my family, my dad, always interested in the news and watching the news, and so we knew about the Vietnam War. And I remember one night, and I only remember it because my brother and sister were so shocked at me and horrified. But I prayed that the Lord would bless the Viet Cong. They were like, no, no, no. And then my mom, who was very diplomatic, she's like, well, we want God to bless everybody, right? So, but they were the bad guys. But I remember my dad talking about the Vietnam War and with Johnson, because there was so much politics. He kept sending in tons of troops and all of this escalation. Let me give you numbers. He sends in first 3,500 Marines. Then in April, I want to say it was in April. No, in May of '65, he sends in 40,000. And then the next month, he sends in 50,000. And by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, we have well over 500,000 troops in South Vietnam helping to fight this war. That is escalation with a vengeance, right? And my dad was like, either go in and finish the job and get out, or get out, which is the way most Americans were, because there was just this political game going on with the Vietnam War. And it's like, If you're gonna go to win and get out, or just stop, because, and this all hits the fan when we get to 1968, which with an event called the Tet Offensive. Tet is a Vietnamese holiday. And it's a celebration of their Lunar New Year. So imagine New Year's Eve, right? You got fireworks and all that kind of stuff. So what happened on that New Year celebration, during that New Year celebration in 1968, the North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, started bombing South Vietnam. They pushed into, military troops. They push in, they attack the palace in Saigon. I think it was in Saigon. They blow a hole in the U.S. Embassy wall. There were like 5 key points that they hit. And they were quick invasions, quick hits, and they were massively powerful. And for the Americans, it shocked them, because they had been getting all of this news, and I don't have it up here, but it's up there. The Tet Offensive creates what becomes known as, and politicians and historians call it, the credibility gap. Because up until 68, Johnson's like, we're winning this war, we're sending our troops in, we're the forces of freedom fighting against the forces of slavery, right? Send your boys. And we've got a draft going on, and we've got, right, this war just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. And then in 68, we, the South Vietnamese and American troops who are there, we suffer huge losses in that Tet Offensive. And Americans got, and then it's just flashed all over the news. This is what's going on. And then the news started kind of turning on what's happening. Not kind of, but really, right? What is really going on over there? And Americans are like, well, wait a minute. We thought we were, fighting the forces of slavery, and this was working, and we're America, and right? And so this becomes very shocking to Americans. Now, the military, the U.S. military and the Vietnamese managed to push back against that Tet Offensive. Militarily, on the ground, it was a South Vietnamese / U.S. victory. But at what cost? And that's what Americans here at home were starting to scream about. At what cost? We have over 500,000, well over 500,000 troops there. That's not counting the military, the support that they're getting by air, right? They're getting all sorts of, we are in this war. And it's a type of warfare that we had never fought before. Guerrilla warfare, right? And one of the reasons that I want you to read that book, you remember being little and hearing guerrilla warfare and wondering why are guerrillas involved in the war, right? But this is like World War I and World War II, trench warfare, right? The whole goal: you dig a trench and you move forward, and you conquer ground and you dig that trench, right? And you conquer territory. This was not happening in the Vietnam War. It wasn't about territory, because you're in South Vietnam and you've got Viet Cong forces there in South Vietnam. If you're a U.S. military soldier and you don't know who your enemy is, and they're not lining up behind a trench or in a trench fighting you lined up here, right? They're in the woods and in the villages and right? And they're throwing bombs at you, and they're like, and you don't know who the good guys and who the bad guys are. And it becomes so stressful. And American casualties start kicking up, and on the news every night. Americans are seeing on the news caskets, flag-covered caskets coming home, right? And we think about the heroes of World War II. We just had Veterans Day, right? And you have your veterans stand up, and they're all like 70, 80, 90 years old. And we tend to think of older people, mature people, right? Who's fighting this war in Vietnam?
Yeah. Us, basically, are. Mhm.
18, 19, 20-year-olds fighting this war. Americans are at home watching their news. And whose boys are those? They're some, right? They're grandsons, they're nephews. They're coming home in caskets covered by flags. And our government's doing throwing more in. Are we winning? Are we conquering any ground? Is it stopping? It's not stopping. Oh my word, right? And Johnson just escalates, and more come home. So we'll get to the book, and then we'll finish the book and come back next week, right, on Monday, with Johnson. That Tet offensive really creates this credibility gap. What's going on in Vietnam? Why are we there? And Americans start questioning, why are we there? Why did we even get involved? And who knows what Kennedy would have done had he been president. It seemed like he wanted to avoid this major escalation crisis. Johnson's kind of crazy with it. But your book talks about an event, and very complex. History is very complex. It's called the My Lai Massacre, and the My Lai was a Vietnamese village, and American troops were there. Charlie Company. It's about a military troop. Charlie Company, C Company, I think they called it, and talks about the rules of war. You're going to read about the Geneva Accords. You're going to read about how American troops were trained. Because is all fair in love and war? Is everything, like, if you're at war, can you just shoot anybody? You just go like crazy? No, there are rules of war. Does war seem like organized and like there's rules? It does. It just sounds really weird, right? But there are rules of war, and there is morality in war. I know, it seems crazy, right? But Geneva Accords, I mean, there are things that you can and you cannot do.
Like
right?
shoot citizens.
Pardon me?
Like shoot civilians.
You cannot shoot civilians. Exactly.
That's a war crime.
War crimes, exactly. Which seems crazy, right? Because war itself just seems criminal. We don't like war. But there, you have to have honor even in warfare, right? You're going up against another military. So this Charlie Company says that they get this message from their superior, their commander, to go into My Lai, this village they're in this region that they call Pinkville. Not quite red, communism, right? But pink. And this commander says, just take everybody out. So one of the things that in war, part of, a war crime, when you're in the military and your commander says, do this, what do you do? Do it. Right? You're taught to obey commands. And in the book, it has like the Geneva Accords, it has like the rules of war, and there's a code of conduct card that they have, and the military troops are trained in that, how to behave in war, what war crimes are. But they're given the command to go in and just wipe everything out. Well, civilians were killed. And let me say, students always go, You didn't tell us that this was a terrible book. My goodness, it's called The My Lai Massacre. Bad things happen. So just be prepared. You're not going in and you're not reading about a happy ending story, right? People were murdered, mutilated, raped. It's horrible. So what I want you to do, and instructions for the paper. Is to answer a question. Who was found guilty of war crimes committed during the event now known as the My Lai Massacre? And do you agree or disagree with this ruling? Why or why not? The people who were found guilty, do you feel they were really guilty? Or do you feel that others should have been found guilty? Because they went to there was a military trial, right? So dig into it. It's not easy reading, right? And it was again Tet offensive, and then afterwards Americans hear about this, and there's this soul searching that's going on. Like, how are we? Right? Who are we? What have we done? And the very complex issue of we're sending 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds into how stressful was that when you go up and you give a kid a piece of candy because the soldiers would hand out and go to the villages and they would give kids candy and then the kids blow you up. For real, right? Who do you think of that? Just and you see your friend that you fought side by side with forever for how long, right? Just get blown to bits by a little kid. What kind of trauma and stress, and I mean, literally put yourself in that situation. What happens to you? Why are we there, right? So this becomes for many Americans, this event, this My Lai Massacre, and we don't find out about it until after the war is over. Very defining for the chaos that the Vietnam War was. And empathy for the people involved in it, maybe understanding, but the crime is still a crime, right? I mean, how do we gauge it? Did we get this right with the criminal trial or the trial? Okay? Not a pretty book. History's not pretty. War is not pretty. Okay. I took 2 extra minutes because I'm not going to see you Wednesday, right? I will send out an announcement. I'll get some extra credit documentaries and if you find something, if you can just do a Google search and if you find something that you find really interesting, it doesn't have to be something that I'm going to put on a list for extra credit. We'll have a couple and do